an important question is, how do we go about interviewing people?
Right. This is something that you and I have kind of debated and discussed a lot. And well, I think the first question was actually whether we should have guests or not. And I think we've both basically decided that yes, good idea. There's a lot of people's ideas that we would like to engage with and hear from personally. So at least that's my main reason for wanting to have guests.
Right. Well, I mean, it's one thing if we're discussing something Uspensky said or something Gurdjieff said or, someone else who's already passed. It's another thing if the actual author of the book is dwelling on the earth, right?
Right.
So then it's a good question to say, hey, could we reach out to that person and get that person's thoughts? Because it's often the case that what a person actually commits to paper, as profound and deep as it might be, is the surface of the thought. I mean, there's more insights and commentary, anecdotes, and so forth that simply didn't make it into the book.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely the case with the book that I finished writing this year. I had to edit it down almost about 30%. So there's that 30% that I really wanted in there, but there wasn't the space for it. But then on top of that, I don't think that the content of the book reflects on where I am in life or even gives like a very good picture of my thinking, because I had to limit the book to a single topic or it would have been basically infinite in length. So you at least hope with an author that the book or the books are just a sort of facet of their thinking, and that by talking with them, you can get a little bit deeper into certain things.
But you still think that a person can get a lot out of your book? I mean, I know because I've read a couple chapters. I was reading chapters as you were going. You were getting feedback from me.
Yeah.
And they definitely got me thinking a lot.
Right.
I mean, now that you mentioned it, one thing we could do is I could just read your final copy and I'll interview you.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Maybe I can be a good guest.
Yeah, how about that? I think that's definitely a doable thing. It's interesting, and maybe we can have other. Well, we've done The Shining, so since the topic of your book is you deal with cinema, but viewed through a particular type of lens, philosophical lens. Well, we'll save that.
Yeah.
So one issue that I've had with conversations, and something I also see on YouTube, is the idea of pushing back. Someone gets criticized because someone says something and they say, why didn't the person interviewing push back?
Yeah.
And it's not always clear to me, because in some respects I understand that to kind of help to move the dialectical process forward.
Yeah.
But there's another kind of Padme Sambhava, let the phenomenon play kind of approach,
Right.
where if you kind of open a space and let it manifest in its fullness, and then you can actually really see what you're even dealing with in the first place. I think sometimes people push back prematurely and they don't even really know what the other person is saying.
Right.
That's pretty popular. Yeah, that is kind of an issue. I mean, I've had that where I was speaking to someone. It was three people,
Right.
and I was trying to get more from this person, and the other person there was annoyed with me because I wasn't pushing back enough against what the other person was saying. And my issue was that I already know how the person who wanted to push back was really thinking about these things.
Right.
And I already knew how I was thinking about these things.
Yeah.
I wanted to get a full picture of how this other person was thinking about the topic, because I might disagree with you on a particular facet of what you're talking about. But if I don't have the whole context, I don't know how you were framing things such that you arrived at that understanding.
Right.
And kind of allowing that all to show itself, I think is the most, well, it's the most revelatory. It's the most actual unconcealment you're going to get.
Yeah. Well, I've thought about the problem, if it can be called that, of having guests on our podcast quite a bit, and the structure in my head kind of basically turned into a binary tree where we start with, are we going to have guests or not? Yes. Okay, we're going to have guests. And then there's a bunch of yes and no questions after that. And to give just one example, I'm pretty sure that people have noticed that many guests on podcasts are there because they're basically selling a product, whether it's a new book or a new documentary or whatever. They're trying to get word out about their new production. And so one of the sort of binary tree questions then would be, is our guest trying to get word out about a new production? And then if the answer is yes, then okay, well, how far do we push back before the introduction to their new production is basically just them being criticized and it turning into a sort of anti-commercial?
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. 100%. I mean, it's almost like, so talk to us about your new whatever. That's your thesis. Well, then be prepared to defend it.
Right. So yeah, if we have that question, is it basically, is part of the guest coming on for PR purposes? And then yes. And then, okay, well, how far do we push it in that situation? And I think that in those situations, we probably have to play a little bit, I don't know how you would say it, just let them express and describe what they've been up to without us really engaging in much of anything that could turn it into an anti-commercial.
Okay, so basically you're kind of proposing something like the way I was describing that conversation where it was three of us and
right.
The guy wanted me to push back and I was like, I want to really understand what this guy's point of view is.
Right.
But then I guess another thing that comes up is, if you do that, then are you somewhat under an obligation to show the opposing perspective when you're choosing another guest? I mean, suppose someone, like, for an example, here's an example. Robert Price is a great mythicist. So a mythicist is someone who basically holds that Jesus never actually existed, or if he did, the figure Jesus bears, almost no resemblance to the figure who we see depicted in the Gospels.
Uh-huh.
If he comes on and and we're sitting there listening to his thoughts and we're not pushing back, we're just trying to get a full picture of how he frames this issue.
Uh-huh.
Should at some point, should we have somebody on who is, an equally kind of powerful, intellectually credible representative of the view that the historical Jesus was a real figure and so on and so forth?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. And I think it's also a good suggestion. I mean, at least in the cases where it is possible. I mean, if we talk about something like mystical experience and we have a guest on that wants to speak about it, I don't really think we need someone to come on and basically just poo-poo the whole idea. But yeah, I mean,
you don't want to have James Randi on or something.
Right. So yeah, I think there will probably be situations where we could do something like that, and that we should.
Right. Well, I mean, are there any subjects that are taboo, though?
Do you have any idea on that?
Well, if it's really taboo, I might not even want to mention it now. Are there things we should avoid? I guess my issue with just dealing with it generically is, if it's a taboo topic, will addressing it only be interesting because it was taboo, or will it be interesting because it might hold the key to something? Because that's that to me would be more interesting. Like just saying like, okay, I want to hear this side of the story. It should be heard is one thing. You know, I mean, like for example, a lot of some podcasters, some people got some criticism, but also got a lot of publicity that put them on the map more by discussing questions like race and IQ.
I can't really think of anything that I would consider, off limits for the podcast. Just basically, where our interests lead us.
Right. Okay.
So one thing that I think we would both worry about, of course, if we're, if we have a guest on that we don't agree with, or we don't really agree with the way that they've, come to their conclusions or whatever, if we don't call them on it, then it can definitely sound to the audience as if we agree with them or are even helping to push their agenda.
Right, because especially if they are promoting a book, so they say, "Oh, so that's what you think of this issue, race and IQ or Christianity or whatever." Because that's exactly what I've heard.
Yeah.
That was the criticism. Somebody, well, I mean, I'll come around and say, like Sam Harris had Charles Murray on,
Right.
and there wasn't, I think he was criticized because there wasn't much pushback.
Right.
And that's part of like a whole, I don't know. I mean, there's different terms that they use referring it to like an alt-right rabbit hole or whatever.
Right.
There's a lot of race and IQ. I'm personally actually not interested in that topic, for one.
Race and IQ, yeah, I'm not either.
What I would be interested in is maybe looking at some issues pertaining to intelligence that might have some bearing on race and IQ, like in the sense that studies that show how a person's economic status could affect their performance on an intelligence test. And maybe that's something that should be taken into account when considering the type of data that's discussed by people who talk about race and IQ. But for me, it would be more interesting in terms of any topic like that, of how you could, something that would be actionable by the listener. Like,
right.
Can you improve the way that you perform on a test? Like, are there things that you can do? Right. Is there something actionable, not just part of some like endless war in society?
Right. Yeah, I don't find IQ that useful to begin with. And then there are also issues with when talking about race. It's really difficult to tease that apart from culture.
Right.
And I mean, just as a simple example, I remember looking at some IQ test questions a while ago. And I tried to look at it, as if I were not myself, as if I were an alien or something like that, and see what I could see about it. And it was very easy in basically every question to pull out parts of it in the way that it was structured and so on, that had a lot of, cultural assumptions behind it. So, for example, English is read left to right, top to bottom, and then, you'll find that order applied to the structure of the puzzle and the question, which is completely, to someone like, say, from Japan, right, where the reading is top to bottom and right to left, they're already in a sort of uphill battle because they're not used to that mnemonic. And, well, related to that is that if you familiarize yourself with the types of puzzles that are given in IQ tests, I think that you can significantly raise your score. So there's a sort of familiarization with the puzzles, and then a familiarization that comes from being part of a certain culture that formulated the puzzles. There's all kinds of issues. And I guess I find those moderately interesting, but as far as the IQ and race issue, I just don't care.
Right. No, that's definitely interesting. I remember I was taking a complete bullcrap IQ test online, but there was one kind of abstract part that was interesting. But I got the question correct, but it was very similar to a diagram I had been reading in a book on systems theory. So I was, in a sense, had a feel for dealing with that type of pattern.
Right.
So I think that's part of what you're talking about, like all these different kinds of reality tunnels you can be traveling down where you're kind of ready. You're in the perfect cognitive state with the proper set of assumptions or with the proper the prerequisites necessary to deal with that puzzle.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It reminds me of something Stephen Hawking is said to have said, that he doesn't know what his IQ is, and that people who brag about their IQs are losers.
Yeah. Well, definitely. I think there has to be some sort of functional element to intelligence that it's, applied out there and does something for the world.
Well, yeah, I mean, they do that all the time where they publish something like so and so got an IQ, like such and such an IQ score, beating Einstein. And they always bring up beating Einstein and Stephen Hawking. And neither of them ever took IQ tests.
Okay, so this might be overthinking it, but in the case where we basically just have a conversation with a guest and there are no other motives involved, as far as pushing back, it's generally going to be a situation where there's two of us and one of them. So what do you think about that dynamic?
Yeah, that's a good point. But you and I might not have entirely the same position either.
Yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, I mean, if it has the appearance that it's two people ganging up on somebody, yeah, that is a problem.
Right. On the other hand, maybe two different voices could be a better way of getting a person to see reason if it's a situation where they kind of have to be ganged up on.
Well, I kind of look at it like this, like part of the dynamic of what we're working towards is basically to and fro. So it's an organic process where we end up is not exactly the place that either of us necessarily had in mind. That's kind of the whole idea of the real power of dialogue.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree with that.
So, yeah, I basically think that if someone is promoting a book, for example, that's one thing.
Uh,
But if it's an exchange, then I think it's really just a matter of whether or not you're being civil or being reasonable. Which should be a general rule anyway.
right. Well, I have kind of example that, well, the point that I want to make is that I think that we should involve our listeners in some of these decisions as well. To bring up an example of that, I'm a fan of the Joe Rogan Experience podcast, and there have been many cases where his listeners found him to be just, sort of lobbing softball questions at, certain guests, with controversial ideas who are in, positions of power. And it would be more, how could you say it? It would show a little bit more sort of ethical superiority to call them on certain things and see if perhaps if policies that affect many, many people could be bettered or that sort of thing. Particularly, I forgot the guy's name, but he's the head of Twitter.
So Jack Dorsey?
Right, right. And Joe Rogan had him on, and there's obviously so much criticism of the policies of Twitter, and Joe didn't really get into that. And there was a lot of feedback from listeners about that. And so Joe ended up having Jack Dorsey back on again with an outspoken Twitter critic in order for them to sort of battle it out. And so I think that that's the kind of move that we could emulate. If we, for example, have a guest on and we're sort of handcuffed and can't really call them out on too much. But then if we get a lot of feedback from listeners, we might, for example, do a podcast just between the two of ourselves on what we actually think about what happened and so on. Or we might invite the person back on for a little bit more of a mental fisticuffs kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah. Right. In other words, basically be open to audience feedback.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, that's a whole other dimension, though. If you bring up someone who is in a position of power who could affect policy,
Right.
that's also something where I would be inclined to respond immediately.
Yeah, I agree with that. Even if they're selling something, even if they're, trying to get people to elect them or whatever it is, I think because of that position and situation, that it demands that we be a little bit more critical.
Right. Right.
What do you think about this? Is a little strange because, well, to bring up the Joe Rogan Experience again, there was also a recent guest. Have you heard of Bob Lazar?
The name is familiar, but I can't place it.
He has this story about how he worked on alien ships in New Mexico. And, well, there are incredible holes in his story and lots of sort of evidence against what he's saying. And he has no evidence of what he's saying. And he complained of a migraine on the show to give himself an excuse for, if he couldn't remember his story or whatever. and Joe was as soft with him as he was with Jack Dorsey. Whereas on the other hand, we seem to be talking about a more inconsistent two-pronged approach. And I wonder if, there might be some problems with that. If someone is like trying to sell something, then they basically get a free pass to say whatever they want on our podcast. But if they're just coming in for a conversation, then things could get a little bit more heated for them. There's something to that inconsistency. I mean, I guess we could just see how it plays out. But I mean, there's obviously the problem, I think, with basically being soft with everybody.
Well, what about if in the future, I don't know. So he said his job was to help with the reverse engineering of one of 9 flying saucers.
Yeah.
Bob claims one of the flying saucers, the one he coined the sport model, was manufactured out of a metallic substance similar in appearance and touch to stainless steel.
He claims that he worked as a physicist at the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and there are some documents, placing him there. But from what I've heard, what he and his friends show is basically a doctored version, that the part that shows his position as a service technician is missing.
Okay.
And then I forgot, there's either like one or two, like high level universities that he said, he got his physics or engineering degrees from. And when called on it and asked to name.
Oh, yeah. I'm reading about a year. He claims he earned a master's degree in physics from MIT and a master's degree in electronic technology from Caltech. However, there are no records of Lazar attending either MIT or Caltech.
Right. And when called out about it, they asked him, to name who his professors were there. And he threw out some names. And then they looked up those names, and like one was his high school physics teacher.
Wow.
Yeah.
And how did Joe Rogan respond to that?
It just wasn't brought up. The guests were, Bob Lazar and the guy who just made a documentary about Bob Lazar. So he basically only heard, their side.
Well, I don't know. I mean, this is, as I'm reading through, this is obviously just some kind of harebrained construct. Which I think I do have a problem with that, because there's so much mysterious in this world. I don't think we need false leads.
Yeah.
The world is this is a very, very mysterious universe. You don't need, some guy stamping a giant footprint in the mud.
Yeah, you really don't.
I don't know. I would prefer to only have people on that. I mean, if we're promoting something for them, if it's a venue via which they are in some way promoting a book, which is more likely what we'd be talking about. I guess I would prefer that if it's not a good book, maybe we shouldn't have them on.
Right. The other worry, though, of course, is that, the book is good and the person doesn't really live up to it.
Right. No, I mean, I used to live with a dude who, I mean, he was ghostwriting books for people. That does happen.
Yeah. Well, I think that maybe we've hashed out pretty much everything foreseeable.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, basically, I think we have. If we have a guest, obviously, if they were promoting some sort of a medicinal agent or something that we think doesn't work, then don't have them on,
Right.
But yeah, I mean, if you have an author on and if you find it disappointing or however you want to put it, I think you need to kind of just roll with it.
So, do you want to just try to wing the outro and see what happens?
Yeah, I think winging the outro is a good idea.
We could say, if we were going to record an outro, then maybe we should say this and that.
Yeah, like you've been listening to Phenomenoumena with co-hosts Ray, I am he.
And Gino. Yeah, well, we could do it like that.
Yeah, and then we could direct them to all the places where the podcast would be found. Spotify, iTunes, wherever they are. And, check out our webpage, Phenomenoumena.com. What about using this? Can we use this?
Yeah, I think maybe we should use this.